He says things like this. In the information age, consumers quickly came to count on drastically superior quality for less price over time. Well, that's true. That part is true. But then he says things like, the price and quality curves diverge so dramatically that it sometimes seems as if the better something is, the cheaper it will cost. And what he means in the context of this discussion is that, those silly economists with their demand curves and supply curves arguing that when something is better, it will have a higher price, that these economists must be wrong. And we must throw away economic theory because, now the demand curve, maybe it doesn't slope down. Now it slopes up. Or maybe, who knows what kind of, maybe it's a circle or it's some kind of weird or funny shape. We can no longer use basic economic theory to explain prices. Well, look, the point here is simply that over time, with improvements in technology, often costs will go down, right? So a PC you can buy today not only has a lower price, but also is much higher quality than a PC that you would buy 10 years ago. But that is not a violation of the law of demand as formulated, for example, by Karl Menger, which states that other things equal, when at a lower price, a higher quantity will be sold, or the greater the willingness of buyers to buy because they value the product higher, the higher the market or equilibrium price. So Kelly is confusing if you think of this in supply and demand terms, those of you economics students, he's confusing, movements of curves over time with traveling along a given curve at a moment in time, right? So demand curves still slope down. Moore's law does not invalidate the law of demand, okay? A report from the Dallas Fed around the same time. So late 90s, before the internet bubble burst, is when you tended to see the most of these sort of silly claims. Here's another one. Scarcity, the first assumption of the old economy, isn't the dominant feature of the new economy. Now remember, what economists mean by scarcity, what Austrian economics means by scarcity, Professor Hoppe discussed this in his lecture yesterday afternoon, right, is the fact that human beings employ means that are scarce to achieve the ends that they desire. So human action always involves the use of scarce means. We cannot achieve all of the ends that we seek to achieve, so we must consider alternatives, trade-offs at the margin. We face opportunity costs of using resources for one activity as opposed to another. We cannot always have everything that we want. We have to make sacrifices. In other words, we have to economize. That's something that you learn on the first day of any economics course, Austrian or otherwise, maybe not Keynesian, but any decent economics course. It doesn't mean that we're poor or something like that, right? So what they say, scarcity isn't the dominant feature of the new economy. Many of today's markets are awash with goods and services, okay. Sellers compete aggressively for buyers, fine. They discount, they cut costs, they expand markets through relentless promotion and advertising. Like this never happened before 1990? Sellers didn't compete aggressively with each other in prior decades or centuries. They didn't cut costs. Has he heard of Standard Oil? Or Andrew Carnegie, or any of the great entrepreneurs of the past. More of today's companies and industries thrive on quantity discounts. The higher the demand, the lower the price. That's another one of these statements that if read, if you don't, if you're careful when you read it, you think, oh, well, I guess, the law of demand, we can throw it out the window now, okay? The higher the demand, the lower the price. Well, of course, this just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Okay, this is just hype or exaggeration or excitement, carried to ridiculous extremes. Now, if we think about it carefully, first thing we realize is that what appears to be new may be more important. On the margin, it may be more significant. But what appears to be new is not always new. Right? As we read in the book of Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. Well, there are some new things, right? There are new ideas. There are new products and services. But new phenomena are not always as new as they appear. So, it's true that anybody can have a blog, anybody can have a web page, anybody can sign up, can have a Twitter account. So, in an important sense, the cost of publishing has gone down thanks to the new technology, right? But it isn't the case that people never had means of communication at low cost before. If you read the history of the American Revolution, people like Thomas Paine, for example, people were writing small documents against the king, against the authorities, and they were distributing them in little, I don't know if the words would translate, but pamphlets, or sometimes they were called handbills, a little piece of paper that you could distribute. You could print many copies, and you could secretly distribute them sort of in an underground fashion. So it isn't the case that until 10 years ago, the only way to get ideas to a large number of people was to have a big publishing house. And now you don't need that anymore. Well, that's an exaggeration, right? Notwithstanding everything that is remarkable about the internet, we have had communications networks in the past. The telegraph is a good example. The telegraph emerged in the 18th and early 19th century. Some of the earliest telegraphs were visual telegraph systems involving multiple nodes with flags or some other kinds of signals, and then each node would have a glass where you could see the other, and you could transmit messages back and forth. The electric telegraph, of course, coming along later. It's very interesting. There's a book called The Victorian Internet by a journalist named Tom Standage that is all about the history of the telegraph. It's quite fascinating stuff because right around the time that the telegraph, the electric telegraph, began to be used widely, journalists and scholars began writing books and articles that sound exactly like, with quotations just like the two I showed you, saying, everything is different now. We have a new economy because we have instant communication across the globe. Demand curves will not slope down anymore. We don't have scarcity anymore. All of society will change. And of course, it didn't change in as radical a way as they were thinking. In fact, there were even sort of like the equivalent of listservs, and there was texting language that was invented by, the Victorian telegraph operators were doing the 19th century equivalent of LOL and BRB and this sort of thing. The culture was very much the same as it is now. It's true that we have directories of information, repositories of information on web pages, but people have been buying and selling information for hundreds of years. The telephone book is a directory. It isn't as good as an online directory. It's harder to update. It doesn't have as much information. It's more difficult to send from person to person, but it essentially performs the same function. What about the rapid adoption of new technology? Right, so Facebook, I don't know exactly when Facebook first came online. I think somebody showed it to me around 2008, maybe? 2009, I thought it looked stupid, and I think I signed up for an account, but never looked at it again. And then all of a sudden, everybody was using it. People often remark that these kinds of technologies, they diffuse throughout the economy very rapidly. It doesn't take long for a company like Facebook or Twitter to go from completely unknown, no one's ever heard of it, to the thing that everybody's talking about and has millions of users and can get huge amounts of private equity from Goldman Sachs and this sort of stuff. that also is not really new. Some of you, if you've taken a course in the theory of innovation, you've probably seen a picture like this one with the curve. They call it an S curve. It looks like the letter S. There was a guy named Rogers, a technology scholar named Rogers, who described this relationship. They sometimes call it the Rogers curve. And it's meant, so on the horizontal axis is time, and on the vertical axis is the number of users. And the idea is to show that new technologies, when they're introduced, in the beginning, only a few people will use them, so-called early adopters. But then all of a sudden, it will reach a point where the rate of adoption increases very fast. And you have this almost vertical section of the curve, and then it flattens out, where almost everybody who's ever going to use it is already using it. It's like Facebook, right? Just like I described, nobody had it, then all of a sudden everybody had it, and you probably know a few people who are not on Facebook, maybe your grandmother, and she's probably not going to ever get it, okay? But if you look at the history of other kinds of technology, the adoption rate often follows the same pattern. It's true for electricity, automobiles, refrigerators, washing machines, telephones, video recorders. Almost all forms of new technology for the past 100, 150 years or more have also been adopted at more or less with the same pattern. So again, this is nothing that's completely new. There's a very interesting book by a Yale University law professor named Benkler called The Wealth of Networks, play on Adam Smith's title, The Wealth of Nations, where he describes, he calls it commons-based peer production. He means things like Wikipedia, open source software, right, where many, many people in a community, online community, can participate without kind of central ownership, without central direction. He describes it as a more kind of democratic means of producing products like Wikipedia or Linux or something, a more democratic way of producing goods and services that's better than a hierarchical, more exclusive way. Yeah, Benkler is coming from the left and arguing in favor of participatory democracy and this sort of thing. But he makes the startling claim that, peer-to-peer networks and open source networks and so on, this is the first time that many, many thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals have been able to participate in producing things, each adding a small incremental contribution, leading to an end result that is much more than what any one individual could have produced. And, I want to send this guy a copy of Leonard Read's little essay, iPencil. Do you know iPencil? Right? Well, I mean, what he describes as the features that he ascribes to commons-based peer production are exactly how we would characterize the free market. Right? The market is a giant network in which people participate by buying and selling. They contribute to overall social market orders, prices, quantities, the allocation of resources, and so on. So when people say, well, the internet or Wikipedia or open source software is a kind of spontaneous order, we might respond, yes, indeed they are, just as the market is a kind of spontaneous order that has been around, since the beginning of human civilization. Okay?